Welcome, believers. Welcome, conspiracy theorists. Welcome to the wonderfully weird world of the Tinfoil Hat Fan Club, where we talk about all the batshit crazy stuff that goes on in the world. There is loads. Right, on today's episode, then, it's no different. I want to talk. I want to really carry on the Linton Mole Howe theme. Now we've covered the grisly issue of cattle mutilation and the chilling aspects of the alien UFO issue that it raises. Right. And it seems insensible to go next then to the alien abduction side of things. And it seems fair to tell the stories of the victims, these poor people who have the terrifying experience and the total sense of helplessness when being an alien abductee victim, right? Because they're very, very rarely believed. I mean, if you imagine you've gone through such a mental situation, being abducted by aliens and not a soul believes you. But there's millions of them out there. I mean, even if you take 90% of being dotty and made up, that still leaves 10%, you know? And I believe it's far, far bigger than that. All right, so I want to start with a really horrible one. Now, I found this online, and there are a few websites that actually tell the story, but I get my basic information from a website called UFO Insight. All right, please check them out. They're great. They're well worth looking into. All right, pay a little bit of a fee. It's very informative. I really like it. All right, so if you get the opportunity, check them out. But we want to tell the story of someone called Myrna Hansen. Myrna Hansen. Now, apparently, it starts in 1980 with the hypnosis expert of UFO investigator Leo Sprinkle. Now, so who is this Leo Sprinkle? And why is he interested in UFOs, right? Now, it turns out he had a sighting in 1949, right? Leo Sprinkle is a psychologist and a researcher of UFO contactee experiences and was born in August the 31st, 1930 in Rocky Ford, Colorado. Now, I'm going to give you a brief background on him because a lot of this relies on his expertise, right? He received his bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Colorado and in 1961 completed his doctorate in counseling psychology at the University of Missouri, right? So he obviously is a clever chap, isn't he? Now, after 3 years in the administrative department at the University of North Dakota, he moved to the University of Wyoming, where he remained until he retired in 1989. Now, Sprinkle has traced his interest in UFOs to a sighting, like I said, that he had in 1949. He and his wife also had a sighting in 1956. So, Leo Sprinkle, right, that's why it gives him the accreditation it can do for him to look into this woman's account, all right? Now, this account is really chilling and will lead Paul Benowitz, down a path of disturbing and some outlandish conclusions. Now, Paul Benowitz, it's not a good story, right? I'll give you a brief description of him. Paul Frederick Benowitz, right, was an American businessman and a UFO investigator. Now, according to some sources, Benowitz was the target of a government disinformation campaign that ultimately led to his psychotic hospitalisation. It looks like Paul Benowitz's story isn't a good one and he was used by the government to spread misinformation. All right, so Paul Benowitz. But it says in the article I'm reading that other researchers have also looked into this case and from different angles and have all reached the same dark conclusions. So I'm going to tell you the story, right? It's also worth noting that 7 years previously, another abduction case came to light and relatively speaking was very close to where Hansen's New Mexico location, where she got abducted, and would share details so close and similar that you can't use coincidence as an explanation. Right? Even though this story doesn't go into any more detail about the previous abduction story, it was enough for Paul Benowitz to add it as evidence for his theories. Now, if correct, not only is the alien presence on Earth very real, but their intentions to humanity isn't exactly beneficial. all right, this story gets really muddy. There are claims of disinformation, government interference, and a government body intentionally contacting Benowitz and feeding him false information. There is also a rumour that the whole story was made up by the government to get to Benowitz because they had his phone and house bugged. So, proper rabbit hole stuff. But I'm going to tell the story anyway, right? Because there are some people who generally believe her. And there are parts to this story that does get collaborated, all right? So, as Myrna Hansen was driving home from Oklahoma to Eagle's Nest on the 5th of May 1980 with her 6-year-old son, she spotted several UFOs hovering over a field. And to her horror, one of them appeared to be snatching a cow using some kind of tractor beam, and that's quite an important part of this story, so remember that. I know seeing a UFO abducting cattle seems a little far-fetched, but it seems to be a worldwide issue, going as far back as the 16th century. And cattle mutilations are often found after strange lights have been seen in the sky, right? So it's not as batshit as you think it is, right? So she's seen the UFOs, right? And then the next thing she knew, the UFOs were gone and the car engine was no longer running, right? But when she had her regression therapy with Lou Sprinkle, a terrifying story started unfolding, right? So under regression, she says that one of the UFOs had turned its attention to their car. Now, shortly after Hansen and her son were taken into the craft, in the same manner as the cow, the description she would give of her abductees matched your typical grey alien. You know, grey, small, black eyes. Now, each got undressed and was subject to examinations and procedures, all of which was carried out in a cold medical manner, right? Weirdly, now this is where it gets a bit weird, when their medical procedures were done, Hansen and the young boy were witness to the mutilation of the cow. Now, whether this was done intentionally by her captors, she doesn't know. She didn't go into detail, but one of her captors informed her that what they were doing had to be done. I don't know what they meant by that. What do they mean by that? You know, what, they have to capture and mutilate cows? Apparently they do, so, but that's what they said, right? Now, Hansen would also recall seeing a tall man. She said, with jaundiced colouring, he would state their abduction was a mistake and it should never have happened, right? Maybe all they wanted was the cow and she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the evening, however, was going to get a lot more frightening. More frightening than you could ever imagine. All right, so she recalls being led to a hidden elevator and transported to what she called the base city of operation. Now, she recalls she wasn't in the ship then, but somewhere inside the vast mountain range of the region. What I would imagine is very close to Dulce, New Mexico, eh? The alien base, apparently. Now, she quickly scanned her surroundings. She noted more grey aliens working at different stations inside the base, but what shocked her the most, and what's interesting about this, was the presence of humans working alongside their alien creatures. Now, this sounds, like I said, very much like the Dulce, New Mexico base and the Phil Schneider story. And if you haven't checked out the Phil Schneider story, check it out, right? He reckons he was working for the military, and they call them dumps, deep underground military bases, right? He was working on one, and when they were cutting through the tunnel, he came across a load of aliens, and they had a firefight, like a gunfight, and a couple of his friends were killed. All right, check the story out. But as she was taken in the weird activity, sorry, I went on the tangents there, so I'll carry on the story. As she was taken in the weird activity, she noticed her son had gone. Now, any composure she managed to retain had now gone. Going into a panic, she ran from her captors, shouting her son's name. As she ran and ran, she would eventually turn into a dimly lit room. And this is where it goes down the rabbit hole. All right, this is proper scary stuff, right? In this room, she would see large vats and containers. Now, we can assume that she wasn't meant to see this room. right, sensing she was about to witness something beyond comprehension, she still peered into one of the vats. And what was inside was a bubbling liquid that housed suspended human body parts. Now, screaming and crying at the same time, the horror overcome her. She would fall, she would fall to the floor only to be found by her captors and then taken into a different room. Obviously, she was in shock. Now, in this room, several devices were inserted into her body. Now, this is important because this story is far out there, and it's easy, in it, to just dismiss it as make-believe. But these devices were later confirmed by a CAT scan. And don't forget Leo Sprinkle, that he is regressing her, right? Now, her son will return shortly. Apparently, nothing happened to her son. I don't believe he went into a regression. I suppose being such a young lad, you wouldn't want to, would you? But apparently nothing. He didn't see anything. Each then would make their way to a large empty room and be subjected to an intense flashes of light. Now, Hansen would offer that this was some kind of memory rape, because then they were later taken back to their car on the highway, dumped there, and that was it. That was the last of it. The UFOs disappeared and she was just left out on the road. Now, it gets a bit weirder, right, because details of what Myrna Hansen had revealed during a hypnosis session would go to a nearby US military facility. And that military facility is called Kirkland Air Force Base. Now, this is where it gets a bit weird. Rather than dismiss or refuse to acknowledge the incident entirely, they would confirm that her description matched completely a fortified section of its facilities. They would further declare that they believed that the witness was describing their weapon storage complex that housed nuclear weapons and was an underground facility. Now, that's really unusual for the government, isn't it? In an even more and out of left field move from the US military, they were put forward as a serious possibility that Hansen had not physically been in the room in question, but a terrifying abduction experience had forced her into an altered state. Now, that essentially means that she had left her body. Some would call this astral projection. Many do believe the Nazis experimented with this in their concentration camps, noting how severe pain might cause this to happen. Although, obviously, the CIA used different methods, they did research this and conducted basic research experiments, you know, so the CIA was into it. Now, was there an alternative agenda behind the officials at Kirtland and their sudden open-minded approach? It is perhaps interesting to recall that Myrna would claim her abduction had been a mistake. It is also interesting to note that if the abduction and the US military facility don't share a connection, is it merely a coincidence of alien activity near nuclear weapons? Perhaps most chilling is, obviously, the connection to cattle mutilation, and more specifically, the terms of what Myrna claims when she saw human and cattle mutilations. So look, it goes a bit down a rabbit hole, doesn't it? And it's hard not to want to believe this one. Now, let's quickly cover Paul Bennewitz again, all right? Because I think we need to. Now, Paul Bennewitz was one of the several UFO researchers who would take an active interest in alien abduction cases throughout the 1970s. Now, not only were they increasing, but details of them, no matter how far apart the cases were, matched again and again, right? After hearing of cases such as Hansen's, Bennewitz became convinced of an alien colonisation that had been underway for decades. I suppose it's worth noting that Bennewitz is far from being the only researcher to publicly shout out about such claims. Respected academic and UFO researcher David Jacobs, and I will put his picture there, would undertake meticulous research of the alien abduction phenomena. He would ultimately agree with everybody that he's he's abducted with and talked to and gave interviews with that agree with Benowitz's assertion that some kind of hybridization program was underway. Furthermore, Jacob would state that it's his belief that the program was not for the benefit of humanity. Now, many would accuse Benowitz of having a paranoid delusion, and he would spend considerable time in mental institutions. However, it would also come to light that much of the information given to him by supposed trusted sources was in fact the subject of international and intentional disinformation. Richard Doty, right? Richard Doty is one of the most controversial figures in the history of UFOlogy. Doty had a 20-year career with the Air Force, including years as a special agent for the Air Force Official Special Investigations. Now, during that time, he was assigned to conduct surveillance on Paul Benowitz, who had inadvertently, apparently, acquired information about a classified Air Force program. Doty admits he fed disinformation to Benowitz and to other UFO researchers. He also forged documents and muddled the waters. So why do you think he did that then? Right, why do you think Richard Doty was interested in Paul Benowitz anyway? You know, unless it was to make him look stupid and make his research look stupid. Sadly, though, it went a little bit too far, and Paul went a bit. He ended up in a mental institution. It's never a good ending, is it? All right, so that is the story of Miss Hansen and her abduction. What do you think? What do you think? Please drop me a line, look into it a bit if you can find more information out there. So I am going to do a UFO story or an abduction story every week for a little while to get their voices out there, to make you aware that it does go on and it is happening. All right, why it's happening is another thing altogether, isn't it? They do tend to drop them off. They don't tend to hurt them. A hybridization program, I'm going to believe that, you know. Genuinely, I think I do believe that. But what do you think? Right, well, this was the Tinfoil Hat Fan Club. I appreciate you sticking around. Please like, subscribe and ding that notification bell if you can. That would be fantastic. And I will catch you on the next one. Thanks very much.